Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is the Skeptics Bible Project. Happy to be back here with you again. How are you, Ben?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Ben, today we are going to discuss a Joe Rogan interview that has apparently gotten a lot of buzz all over the internet, and I haven't heard it. I actually was going to listen to it and take notes, and I thought, you've already listened to it, so maybe it would be good for me just to hear it with fresh ears as we go and just respond along to what we hear. Why don't you set the scene for us?
So this was a interview that Joe Rogan did with an apologist from Apologetics Canada, which is an online apologetics nonprofit named Wes Huff. And the way that this happened was another internet personality, Billy Carson, who had been on Joe Rogan previously and a lot of those other podcasts in that Joe Rogan universe. So Billy Carson is sort of like an ancient aliens conspiracy theorist, secret texts of the Bible that have been hidden away. So that's his whole brand that he sort of was promoting. And so Wes had done this debate that had been set up with Billy Carson. And Wes is training to get his PhD. He studies the New Testament texts, some textual criticism. And he really embarrassed Billy Carson in this debate and made Billy look really bad and exposed a lot of the methodological flaws that Billy Carson had in his repertoire. And so it created this whole hoopla over the internet where every Christian apologist was praising it and everyone was sort of doing reaction videos to it. And Billy Carson got very embarrassed. And I mean, Wes is going to talk about it a little bit in the interview, but tried to stop it with legal means. And it created all this controversy that eventually Wes got Joe Rogan's attention through this whole thing. And so since Joe Rogan had already had this connection with Billy Carson before, he decided to have Wes come on his show. So about a month ago, or maybe a little bit longer, Wes Huff came on the Joe Rogan show, and they talk for quite a long time. And as you can imagine, it's sort of like a stream of consciousness conversation that touches on a whole lot of different things. So we thought it would be interesting to give our take on some of the things that Wes is saying in this interview.
All right, sounds good. I guess we'll kind of play a clip and then just pause it whenever something occurs to us to say, kind of like what we did in the other interview that Joe Rogan did with, Adam Curry?
Yes.
And you can go back to our podcast archive and check that one out. I guess without further ado, why don't we get going?
I, like many people, was introduced to you because of the debate you had with Billy Carson.
Quote unquote.
It's one of those things where it's very unfortunate when people get caught with their pants down. And I'm not an expert in many things, but the things that I am an expert on, you could wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me about those things. Like martial arts or comedy. I could give you an expert version of reality.
I mean, is he really an expert in comedy? Sorry.
Does not have that. And he is a wonderful talker, and it's a lot of fun. I like watching his videos. I love all that ancient history stuff, and even the most ridiculous tinfoil hat aspects of ancient. It's fun.
It's entertainment.
But when he was on with you, it was quite apparent that you are an actual expert in the Bible and in many religious texts, and that he didn't necessarily have the facts straight. So what was the fallout of all of that?
I literally was asked to do it 24 hours beforehand. Well, and I listened to the stuff he'd said, so I knew enough about the ways that he'd articulated things about the ancient Near East and the Bible and Christianity to know enough that his level is pretty surface. But the fallout was that not only did he not want us to release the conversation, but then he started throwing out cease and desist letters, and then he started, trying to sue people.
What was his argument?
Apart from the fact that he was embarrassed that he lost.
I just want to jump in for a second because I don't know anything about Wesley Huff, so I just did a quick Wikipedia search. And the first thing it says is that he's a Christian apologist and a speaker specializing in biblical manuscripts and Christian theology. He's currently pursuing a PhD in theological studies and sacred and canonical texts at Wycliffe College, University of Toronto. So he's an apologist that does not have a degree, so he's not a scholar.
Yeah, that's already something that's frustrating about this. He gets treated like an expert, and he's not actually an expert in the field of what he's talking about, and he's just a PhD student. Like, he's not even graduated yet.
Right. And it's not like there's not real experts out there.
Yeah. There's plenty of scholars that do a lot of interaction with the public online that he could have on his show if he really wanted to have a Bible scholar. I mean, Bart Ehrman could go on his show.
Right. And Joe Rogan, right off the bat, is basically introducing him to, let's be honest, the largest audience in America. And he's introducing this guy as a biblical expert. What he should be saying is, this guy is a well-known apologist, and he's a student of the Bible. So that's just frustrating, and you can see the way Joe Rogan thinks about history also is that it's really for entertainment. I forgot exactly what they said, but that off-the-cuff remark kind of struck me about, even if it's like the most tinfoil hat crazy stuff out there, I'm still interested in it, or whatever he said. And I think that's the problem. They're not really interested in people that have done the research and really know what they're talking about. They're interested in out there conspiratorial, on the fringes thing because it's fascinating in the way that entertainment is fascinating, the way like science fiction is interesting. And often real history, real science is not really sexy and it's not super entertaining. A lot of times it's very nuanced and difficult to understand. You don't always have clear answers, but obviously that doesn't get the ratings.
John and I talk about it often on the show, but I think there's this gap between the biblical scholarship that you encounter if you go to a church and then like the actual Bible scholarship that goes on at the university. And those are really two different things. Like a theological understanding of the Bible and a historical understanding of the Bible are two different things. And if you're going to compare the Enuma Elish to Genesis, like you're talking about a historical comparison. So it sort of muddles the water between who is an expert and who's not an expert. It sort of hands Wes authority that
he doesn't deserve.
He's not an objective scholar.
Right. On two fronts, he hasn't earned any credentials to be called a scholar or really to be taken serious in this field. There's a lot of people that are, including, by the way, Christians. I'm not saying you have to be a non-believer. There are highly qualified believers who are scholars also. But he's a self-identified apologist, and I think that is a distinction that is not made enough. And I think you were talking about this too. An apologist is not a historian. They're two completely different things. The goal of an apologist is to persuade you that their dogma is correct, and their job is not to lay out all the evidence in a neutral, unbiased way and come up with the most probabilistic perspective, which is really what a historian does. Historian says, well, I put aside my faith-based commitments if I have any. I tried my best to put aside my biases. We use the scientific method to help with that. And we do the research, and then we come up with our findings, whatever they are, whether they support my original faith-based commitment or not. But that's not what an apologist does. So an apologist should not be taken seriously in an academic setting. And again, I haven't heard this yet, so maybe it gets better. But to me, Joe Rogan is already like introducing this person as some sort of an authority in a historical sense when he's not. He's an apologist that's going to try to persuade people that his faith is the correct one. And it gets into what we were talking about in our series with Josh McDowell too, because you put yourself out there as if you're some kind of authority figure. So you get that kind of academic credential. So people will respect you from that perspective. But what you're really doing is you're using that to just try to steer them into your religious claims. It's a little backhanded because you're using your quote unquote credentials, if you have any, in this case he doesn't, is not to inform and educate, to indoctrinate. That's a very different goal.
This is not even supposed to be a knock on Wes Huff. People are biblically illiterate. Biblical literacy is not high. So if Wes Huff comes on this podcast, he's going to know more than like the average listener about the Bible. So that doesn't make him an expert. That just means that those people are going to be fooled by whatever he says. It's not maligning him or his honesty or his scholarship, but he has a certain perspective, obviously, and his perspective is that the Bible is the Word of God. And so he's starting from that conclusion. As we'll see going along, it creates some problematic claims.
The cease and desist letter, the cease and desist letter said, I don't want you to use my name or my face.
What was does he have a lawyer that wrote the cease and desist? Is he a lawyer?
No. So he actually, it's interesting because Mark Menard, who was the guy who hosted this interaction.
This is extremely uncharitable to Billy Carson, somewhat of a quack as well. You know, I watched part of that debate, and it wasn't as crazy as Wes is making it sound. There are things that Billy Carson was getting not completely wrong.
Right.
But he didn't have the command of the issues that Wes had. This is piling on this guy. I guess that's what happens when you go to a debate and you mess up. You're going to get piled on. But Christians, I feel like, complain all the time about atheists are so uncharitable in their interpretation or they're so overly critical. But I feel like this is a very uncharitable reading of how this debate went down.
It's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate.
When you get caught with your pants down, you're supposed to say, I got caught with my pants down. Especially if you're public. Like, it's very clear that you're incorrect.
Well, the irony of this situation is if he just kind of left it, it probably wouldn't have made anywhere close to the splash that it's made. And we told him that. I hoped to have, in our initial conversation, kind of press him a little bit more on the more overt things he'd said about, like, Greek and Hebrew and Sumerian, because I've studied a number of ancient languages, and when you study the languages, you realize the complexities. And so when someone hasn't, and they're making statements that are obviously indicative of someone who hasn't studied them, it's super apparent.
Oof. Correct me if I'm wrong, but was Billy aware that this was going to be a debate, or did he think it was going to be just a discussion? Like, what did he think it was going to be?
Like, he knew we're going to go over some of his stuff that he'd said about Christianity, that I was going to come in, who I was, what my name was, some of my background, and that part of the conversation was going to be me kind of asking him some clarifying questions and rebutting some of the things that he said. So you didn't watch the 3-hour live stream.
I watched a little bit, I'm like, oof, and then I shut it off, then I watched a little bit more, oof.
So unfortunately, Billy there says he had no idea going in. I mean, that's patently false. He knew what it was going to be.
Okay. And he also was claiming that it wasn't a debate, that he had been involved in debates before. It's all very unfortunate. But the good part of it is I was introduced to you and your work. And
there you go.
Very, very extensive and very fascinating. And the videos that you sent me on Instagram, I watched both of those today as well.
Awesome.
So really, really interesting stuff. And your knowledge of the history of the biblical texts and the Codex Sinaiticus and all these different things, very, very fascinating stuff.
What you were saying before, John, again, Joe Rogan doesn't know what he's talking about either.
Right, exactly. I was just going to say that. Like, who is he to endorse him as being some kind of knowledgeable expert?
Yeah, he's like very easily impressed. So
It's basically like he used the word codex and that was it for Joe Rogan to be
Yeah.
like, oof, this guy's amazing.
So that's very frustrating that you don't have the basic safeguards on a podcast to get out good information. It's not the same level of making sure that your guest actually knows what they're talking about.
Right.
So let's just get into your background. Like, how did you get started in your research, and how did you get into this?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were missionaries. So I was born in Pakistan and spent a portion of my childhood in the Middle East with my parents working in Amman, Jordan. And then we came back from the Middle East when I was pretty young. And so I grew up in this very, diverse home in the sense that my mom was a missionary kid who grew up in India. And so we had a lot of, worldview kind of perspectives represented in our home. Like I often say, we had the Bhagavad Gita and the Book of Mormon and the Quran on the shelf.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I think, that always, although my parents were never overt with this kind of stuff, they always had the perspective that, we're Christians. We believe that this worldview perspective is true, but hey, this stuff isn't scary. This stuff isn't, off limits. We can investigate these things.
I just want to point out that Joe Rogan just acted super impressed that they had books on their shelf.
I guess maybe I've heard enough apologetics in my lifetime, but this is a typical
Missionary kid.
I grew up in a Christian home, but they were cool. We were exposed to different ideas. We were super diverse. My mom was a missionary and she grew up in India. I was a missionary and I was born in Pakistan and then lived in Jordan. Diversity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if our listeners necessarily know our history, but both me and you grew up in Christian homes. Your dad was a pastor, and we had friends. Some of them were missionaries, and I was in New York and exposed to lots of different religions. I could basically make the same claims that he's making, and it doesn't make me an expert, and I'm not claiming to be any kind of an expert.
I don't want to be overly critical of Wes Huff because Wes Huff seems like a nice enough person. But it's just this idea that he's going on the biggest platform in America, and he's basically just a normal apologist. You could have Josh McDowell on this podcast, and he would be saying the same basic type of stuff. And we're super critical of Josh McDowell. For all the excitement, every apologist in America was getting so hype about this. This is going to cause a revival. You would just hope that they would be a little more tempered in just buying everything he's selling, just because he knows, again, about the Codex Sinaiticus.
Right, exactly.
And just before my 12th birthday, I actually was diagnosed with a neurological condition that left me paralyzed from the waist down. So that's a condition that's called acute transverse myelitis. What happened was that I had the flu and my body's immune system attacked the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord and caused swelling and cut off the communication between my brain and my legs. I was camping out in the bathroom floor for flu reasons. And when I woke up, about 30 minutes later, I couldn't feel my legs. It was basically instantaneous. And that's what made the diagnosis as severe as it was. Like they said, there's a 30% chance. It was like a small percentage of probability that I would recover, but a much higher percentage that there would be a lot of either complete paralysis for the rest of my life or some kind of issues with walking. It's related to like diseases like multiple sclerosis in that it's neurological. And 1 month from the day that I woke up and couldn't feel my legs, I woke up on a Saturday morning, got out of bed, walked over to my wheelchair and sat down.
1 month.
1 month, yeah. January 8th to February 8th, exactly.
I have a few issues with what he's saying here. Joe Rogan has no idea what condition this is and how likely it is that he would recover, and if 1 month is something amazing or not amazing. So again, it's just everything he says is like, whoa, without any skepticism at all to anything he's saying. Does he go on, Ben? Does he talk about how this was a miracle?
We'll play a little bit more. I'm happy that he's not paralyzed anymore.
Of course.
But also, just in perspective, it was a month, and it was related to his pneumonia, obviously.
Right. Even he said, doctors said I had a 30% chance of recovery. That's not great odds in general, but it's definitely not miraculous territory if you do recover.
And he seemed to be a little inconsistent. I might fully recover, or I might be paralyzed. Well, what did they really say? Because,
like Ben said, I completely agree. We don't wish harm on anybody, and we're glad that he recovered completely. The reason I think that our radar goes up when we hear stuff like this is, again, we grew up in a Christian world also, and we would hear stories like this all the time. Stories of miraculous healings. I remember always hearing stories about the pastor praying over somebody and their deformed hand was restored, or they grew back limbs. And of course, no one ever saw it. It was, someone in another church's cousin told them about it, that kind of thing. You just hear this kind of stuff all the time, and it's always to bolster that there's some kind of supernatural miracle happening here. And one of the big problems I have with that is, well, what about the people that don't get miraculous healings? To me, it's almost saying, well, God is really looking out for me. He had something special in mind for me. And then you have all the philosophical problems about, well, if he's an all-powerful, all-sovereign God, then he is the one that afflicted you with it in the first place. We don't need to go down that whole road. Just to say that we've heard a lot of this type of thing before.
How Wes interprets what happened is one thing. He can interpret this as God healing him, and that's fine. I'm not here to tell him how he should interpret different events that happen in his life. But to frame it like we all should interpret it that way is a stretch. There's no, the correlation is not causation. And I don't think that the evidence is sufficient for making that type of claim.
If you're going to make a name for yourself as an apologist, it always helps to have a really strong backstory. We talked a lot about this with Josh McDowell. If you can say, well, you had a miraculous healing. When I looked him up, I see that everywhere. He's trying to tout his backstory. He's trying to create this history of himself. Not to say that he's lying about it. In the case of some apologists, they do lie about it, and they definitely embellish it. Again, it's not about the scholarly research that he's done. It's about his backstory that people can identify with. And again, that's not going to get you any closer to truth. It's just getting you closer to maybe liking him or being persuaded by him.
Part of what is going to become more evident through this interview is this implication of something miraculous happening without necessarily explicitly saying it, and it'll really become evident later on. I have a big problem with something that is said. We'll let Wes continue to tell his story.
Sounds good.
What treatment did they give you?
So I spent 11 days in the hospital being overseen by pediatric neurologists and specialists in this, because it's a very rare condition. And so they were studying me, and they gave me steroids, and they did some other tests, but really there was no true kind of treatment in that. So I was doing physiotherapy. I would be pulled out of gym class in school, but it was a little bit of a joke. Like, can you move your legs? Can you? It was.
Could you move anything?
No, nothing.
Could you feel anything?
No. In fact, when I was in the hospital, I'd wake up and there'd be pinpricks in my legs, because they'd be testing where the reactions were. And they'd have used a syringe. And so I'd wake up and there'd be these tiny little pinpricks in my legs, because they'd been testing while I was asleep to see what the kind of, whether it was registering neurologically with anything. But I couldn't feel anything.
It reminds me of Luke Skywalker in Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah, I know
when
the
he's
scene you're
floating
talking
in
about.
the water and he's getting his hand repaired.
I was fully a paraplegic.
Whoa.
Yeah, but going back to that, so I experienced this, what I consider to be a true supernatural experience, in that I walked into the hospital to the doctors that had overseen me, and they were the first ones that used the word miracle. They said, we really don't have any type of medical explanation, and mainly because there was no atrophy. My muscles in those 30 days were fine.
I call bullshit. Get a doctor in to tell me that. Elsa, you yourself said early on that the doctors gave you a 30% chance of recovery. So now you're saying, I recovered and there was no atrophy.
I almost am reluctant. He's so careful about how he's phrasing everything. I had a supernatural experience, and
Right.
the doctors were the first ones to call it a miracle. Did the doctors all become Christians afterwards?
Right. Good
Did they
question.
start affirming your God? And then the atrophy. So was the miracle that you got healed, or was the miracle that when you were healed there was no atrophy?
It's always these type of stories that you just kind of have to take his word for it about what the doctor said. The doctor said that, so it must be true. Okay, and well, I guess I'll just believe you on that.
Wes, again, seems like a nice enough person. I don't like when people are paralyzed at 11 years old, but I've just heard this so many times, this same type of thing, that I'm extremely skeptical.
And I've said in previous podcasts, there used to be, I don't know if it's still around, but I think it was a website called Why Doesn't God Heal Amputees.com, I think it was. And but that's a good question, because it's something like this where, well, the real miracle was that my muscles didn't atrophy. That was the real miracle. And it's kind of difficult to really pinpoint. But where's the miracle where, his arm was gone and then the arm grew back? You never see that. And there's definitely no documentation of anything like that. So it's always something that's really kind of hard to prove. There's no doctor that's coming forward on the record and saying, yes, there was no medical explanation for this, and I say it was a supernatural miracle. You just have to take his word for it.
I would be interested in hearing more about the case because I think it's kind of fascinating, but it just seems to me that there's no reason that it has to be a miracle. It seems to me there's pretty natural explanations for the whole healing.
That's crazy. Because I've broken limbs before and had them in casts, and just in the 6 weeks that you have a cast on, you have massive atrophy.
Okay, 6 weeks is longer than a month.
Predication for them using the word miracle. And so that's it marks this, what I do consider to be this supernatural, something happened. But
did you feel like that was a calling that led you to a very specific mindset after that?
It's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, as much as you could at 12 years old.
Right. But it must have had a significant impact on your psyche.
I realized, okay, there's something out there. Something happened that I can't totally explain on naturalistic terms. But how do we go from that to saying, okay, well then this worldview is correct? And so despite being raised in a Christian home, I felt like my parents telling me what was true is not the worst reason to believe it, but it's also not the best. And so as a teenager, I did a lot of kind of soul searching. And like I said, I was able to do that to a certain level of degree because of the openness within my household, where I pulled the Quran off the shelf and I read it, front to back, just trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here? What's all this about?
Right.
The thing I do give Wes credit for is staying on message. He really does have his testimony down. He doesn't divert from it. Again, I'm open. I was exposed to different other religious beliefs. My house wasn't this closed-off fundamentalist place where we weren't allowed to think. I'm a free thinker. I really wanted to explore what's true.
He has his practiced, rehearsed bio that I'm sure he's given many times and will give many more times. Again, it reminds me of Josh McDowell and many other apologists.
Yeah.
And that was about a period of about a year and a half. And at the end of that, I did truly feel that, okay, well, I think in the ways that in my limited ability as a teenager to investigate these things, I think that Christianity is true. But it wasn't until I went to university where I was engaging with people of other faith perspectives in Toronto at York University, where I was talking to Muslims and Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses and atheists, from the gamut. Mm-hmm. And I was having these conversations and I was expressing kind of my perspective on what I believed. And they would say things like, well, that sounds great, Wes, but, that's all the Bible. You can't trust that. And so that's where I started to take the...
Do Mormons say that to you?
Well, yes.
That's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Well, in the sense that,
the Mormon one is the craziest one.
Yeah.
Because we know who wrote it.
Yeah.
And he's a shady dude.
He is a shady dude.
I don't want to defend Mormons in the Book of Mormon. But there's nothing crazier about believing the Book of Mormon than there is about believing the New Testament. If you think it's crazy to believe the Book of Mormon, it's just as crazy, if not crazier, to believe the New Testament. And his rationale was, well, we know who wrote it. And what did he say about him? He was a bad dude.
Yeah.
Mormons don't believe he was a bad dude. You know what I'm saying? And here's the thing. We don't know who wrote the New Testament. We have a good idea that the Apostle Paul wrote some of it. And if you want more on this, go listen to virtually any one of our previous episodes where we do a lot of talking about the authorship of the New Testament. But we don't know who wrote it. And that leaves even more problems with trusting it.
Yeah, I think it's funny. They get into Mormonism a little bit more, so maybe I'll just play it, but they sort of touch on that idea too, that like the difference between a cult and religion. But yeah, if you were a first century Jew, you wouldn't look at Jesus much different than the Christians look at Joseph Smith.
I don't know why lately, Ben, I have a little bit more, I don't want to use the word sympathy, but I'm not as, let's say, critical against Mormons as I used to be. A lot of Christians with things like the Book of Mormon, they're like, oh yeah, look at those crazy people. That's not like us.
Yeah.
We're the normal, sane ones. But I don't know. I think the Mormons in America in recent years, they've shown a little bit more integrity with their faith than evangelical Christians, which have basically let American Christianity turn into just a white nationalist shit show. It's just a laughingstock to the rest of the world. Mega churches with insane programs going on, people running around screaming in their services. American white evangelical Christianity is at the lowest point I've ever seen it. And the Mormons have maintained some decorum. They actually showed a little bit of pushback to some of the worst things from MAGA Christians or MAGA Americans. Not a lot, not as much as I'd like to see, of course, but we've seen that it exists. So I've actually kind of softened my criticism of Mormonism in general. And I don't think Christians should be able to look at them as like, they're the crazy ones and we're the normal ones.
Judgments that these in-groups make on their out-groups, the same criticism could be turned towards them. You know, like Mormons have progressive revelation. Well, the church also has practices that have evolved over time and teachings that have evolved over time. Like, you may not call it progressive revelation, but certainly things have changed.
What do you call it when the Pope comes up with a new edict that completely changes the entire history of Christianity? Happens all the time.
Or when somebody comes up with the rapture in the 1800s,
right,
or inerrancy in the 20th century. These are new doctrines. This is something that just came out of nowhere. So
yeah, when it's your own religion, you're not able to see these changes. When you follow it, you don't have that outside perspective to say, whoa, this is really evolving. Yeah, there's been tons of changes, and it's constantly happening.
There's a basic level where religion doesn't function fully rationally. You accept the internal circular arguments. So Christians are perfectly comfortable saying the way that we understand the Trinity in our faith is this. And you're like, well, that doesn't sound like it actually makes logical sense. But they're like, but this is the way that we understand it. It's the same with the Mormons. They have a certain understanding. It may seem crazy from the outside, but they only have to make it make sense circular. Like the circular logic has to connect. And that's the main thing.
But I don't know. When I think about some of the batshit insane things that Joe Rogan has said on his podcast, and then to hear him snicker under his breath at how crazy those Mormons are, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, that's a fair criticism. He's not exactly the greatest arbiter of truth.
So they would believe, I think it's the 10th article of the Mormon Church, is that they believe the Bible insofar as it is translated. And so they have this perspective that there's been things that have been affected. I mean, Joseph Smith made his own translation of the Bible, and it's rough.
And when he was 14.
Yeah. Well, I think it was later on that he made the Joseph Smith translation. But
really?
I don't even know if the official LDS Church ascribes to the Joseph Smith translation, because I think they even see this is, we know what the Greek and the Hebrew looks like, and this is not even. Yeah.
Well, he was a legitimate con man. Yeah, which is fascinating. That it's people have such a deep search for meaning and truth that if you are confident, and which is what a con man is, confidence man. If you are really good at expressing yourself and really, like, you show confidence in your convictions. You can persuade a lot of people.
There's something to be said about being able to take the message of a faith and modify it and metamorphosize the different tenets. Imagine you were a first century Jew who was waiting for the apocalypse to come, and you were convinced that one of the many failed messiahs was actually the real Messiah and had been risen from the dead, and that your goal as a Jew was to go and bring Gentiles into Israel to prepare for the end. That certainly wouldn't align easily or clearly with anything that was coming before. It would be sort of a new thing. That's what Paul did.
I was going to bring up Paul also because Paul goes back so far, and we have so little to stand on that we have no idea if Paul was a con man. I mean, me and you have talked about that a lot. It's very possible Paul was just a con man, but we don't have any access to that. And Joseph Smith, again, I'm not defending him or the Book of Mormon or Mormonism in general, but one thing that needs to be said is call him a con man. The guy was a genius. To be able to write the Book of Mormon the way he did, people read that it comes across like a biblical scripture. And it's not easy to do that. You have to be incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly learned. I would put Joseph Smith up against Wes Huff any day as far as biblical knowledge. Joseph Smith would destroy him. I'm sure of it, because Joseph Smith knew the Bible probably better than anyone on planet Earth right now. He was incredibly knowledgeable. I mean, I don't know a lot about Joseph Smith, but I know at least that much about him. And I'm not defending him. It very likely is that he was some sort of a con man. I mean, I certainly don't think he was a prophet that received, golden tablets from the angel Moroni. So, I think it's very probable that he was a con man. There seems to be a lot of casting dispersion on other religions as if the evangelical Christianity is the good one. And that one, there's no fraud that led up to the Bible that we have today. There's no fraud that led up to Orthodox Christianity. Well, let me tell you, go back through Christian history, and what do you find? You find loads and loads and loads of forgeries and fake letters and fake relics and fake shrouds of Turin and fake miracle claims all over the place. It's just littered with forgeries and lies all throughout Christian history up until our modern day. So don't sit here and look at Joseph Smith like, oh, well, he's a con man and we can just kind of laugh him off. But we have the true Christianity. No, it's been built on lies and forgeries all the way through. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
We've talked about it a little bit before, but the way the author of the Gospel of Matthew uses the Hebrew scriptures, twisting them and taking them out of context. You have to apply the same standard to your own religion that you do to judge everyone else.
Ben, you were just telling me the other day about a letter from Jesus Christ, right?
Yes.
And who was in possession of this letter?
Well, it's in Eusebius's history.
Right. Now, Eusebius is somebody that people like Wes Huff, I don't know if he has done this. My guess is he has, but definitely Josh McDowell will quote Eusebius as a valid source, a historian that we can rely on. Well, Eusebius had a letter from Jesus, and you can hear in the tone of my voice that I don't believe that was a genuine letter written by Jesus. It was a forgery. It was a fake, just like that era of Christian history is littered with. So point the finger at yourself first before pointing it at somebody else.
Yeah, I think that you raised another good point. Again, the criteria that we use to gauge the Gnostic Gospels, we should use to gauge the regular Gospels. The canonical texts should be judged by the same standards that we judge the deuterocanonical text, because they have some of the same features, like exaggeration, filling in the gaps, the repeated expansion of minor character stories, theological explanations that arise later on to that sort of clean up earlier details. It's always good to remember to continually to apply the same standard to the things that you're reading and not just say, well, this is canon, and so therefore it's judged by a different standard than the Book of Mormon or the Gospel of Thomas or the infancy Gospel of James.
For instance, the Book of Mormon, we believe Joseph Smith wrote it and that it wasn't some sort of miracle. But let's take the pastoral epistles. Well, we just did episodes on this. We don't know who wrote the pastoral epistles, but we know that it was not Paul. That's pretty much the consensus of all modern scholarship. Yet it's in every Bible, in every church across the world. And it says right there, I, Paul, am writing this. I'm paraphrasing. They're talking about all this fraud with Joseph Smith. Well, I would consider that fraud, wouldn't you? If somebody's claiming to be the author of a book that they didn't actually write. I don't really have no problem at all criticizing a religion, especially for trying to con people. That's actually a very good endeavor. I think we all should be doing that. And that's kind of what me and you are trying to do here, but we're not only looking at the one that we don't like. We're trying to be fair across the board. And that's not what he's doing because he's an apologist and he's not going to highlight all the lies and deceits and cons coming from Christians throughout the years. And a lot of those cons, by the way, have to do with bogus miracle claims, which I strongly suspect that his own healing story is a bogus claim.
Yeah, I hate to belabor this point. I feel like it's sort of like a tangent that we've gotten off on, but you could do the same thing with the way apologists talk about evidence for the Exodus. We have evidence in the text. Just because we don't have archaeological evidence doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Well, couldn't we say the same thing about the Book of Mormon? It makes claims. We may not have archaeological evidence to back them up, but we should assume that that text itself is actually a source, right? Well, no, that's not the way it works. You have to actually figure out what's going on in history during that time to be able to see if the text is even plausible or if it's just a complete fabrication or a complete work of fiction.
Yeah, and I feel like he should have on a Mormon to respond to this. There are Mormon scholars and experts that will try to refute what Wes Huff is saying. So far, I mean, we're not very far into this, so I don't want to criticize him for things that haven't happened yet or that maybe he's going to do better. But I'll just say this, so far preliminarily, he doesn't seem to be all that smart. None of the things he's saying, he basically, with Joseph Smith, he just made accusations. It's just not a good translation. Like, okay, well, tell me why it's not a good translation. And he's done that a few other times. Even when he was talking about his medical problems, he was just like, I was seen by neurological people. Like it just wasn't all that technically precise. I don't know. Maybe I'm being a little harsh on that. I mean, he was 11 years old when he was sick. But in general, I haven't been really blown away with his intelligence here.
Proportional to the amount of praise and authority he's been vested by Joe Rogan, he's not an expert to the level that Joe Rogan seems to imply that he is.
And it's frustrating to me that Joe Rogan has become like a kingmaker. Like, how come Joe Rogan has this power? Like, Joe Rogan is not an intellectual heavyweight. Let's just say that. And the idea that somehow random people that pique his interest, he can turn them into these major celebrities. I don't know what's wrong with our country where that's even possible. But here we are, I guess.
It's incredibly frustrating. Even leading up to this interview, I think Wes had said that some people were trying to push to get him on Rogan. He said that the way that it works is Joe has to come up with the idea himself. If he feels like someone else is telling him, then he's going to be like resistant to it. So it's like he really is a kingmaker as far as being able to decide who's able to get out on this platform.
Yeah, and it's not really a criticism of Joe Rogan to say that. I mean, it's not really his fault. He's doing a podcast and people really love it apparently, and they tune in and he's got a huge audience. It's not his fault. I think it's more of a criticism of our culture that somebody like Joe Rogan has that kind of power. If we were talking about MMA fighting, great. Yeah, he knows what he's talking about, I'm sure. Or if he's talking about how to host Fear Factor, he knows what he's talking about. Or if he's just entertaining, great. But to all of a sudden make these celebrities who are supposedly academics, well, Joe Rogan doesn't know what he's talking about on this front at all. And it's very clear when you hear this to people that do know what they're talking about. I mean, has Joe Rogan had Bart Ehrman on the show?
No.
He would be someone I'd like to see on Joe Rogan. There's a lot of, like I said, not just skeptics, but even Christian scholars that I would give more credit if Joe Rogan was doing that. And again, it's hard to really criticize him. I do wish he had showed a little more scrutiny in the people that he had on as guests, knowing the type of power that he has. But I don't really expect that to happen. In this case, he's not doing anybody any service by having these people on and treating them as if they're the people that everyone should be listening to.
There's such a lack of biblical literacy. Even growing up in the church, understanding the historical context of the biblical writings, it would be nice for people to get that out in the public. That's one of the things that we really care about on the show, is trying to get that stuff out into the public so people are thinking about this in a historical way. They're not just thinking about the plot that's internal to the Gospel of Matthew, but they're thinking, what is the author of the Gospel of Matthew trying to say to his audience in his time? What are his interests that he's trying to speak to? Instead, you're getting people like Russell Brand or Adam Curry or even Wes Huff. You're getting a much less academically rigorous and historical view of Christianity and much more of a fluffy theological view. Wes is maybe a little bit better of a theological view, but this is not really talking about the history of the text.
Again, I'm sure he goes on, so I'm kind of waiting for him to get into it to see how he does. Because so far, it's really just been background.
Well, let's continue.
People.
Yeah, confidence is not competency.
Yes.
And unfortunately, those things get confused a lot.
Well, he covers up for competency sometimes.
Yeah.
In everything.
I won't go on a huge tangent. I just find this incredibly ironic because this is literally what Joe Rogan does all the time. It's just spouts total nonsense with confidence, and sometimes he's fact-checked in real time and is shown to be wrong on his show. But a lot of times he's not corrected on his show. He very often gives bad information with confidence.
Totally agree. And you almost couldn't come up with a better way to define right-wing America right now. And, Joe Rogan endorsed Trump. And is there any better way to define Trump than saying overconfidence?
It's very difficult to be an expert. And I think people want to believe that they are. And they don't want to do the work.
Right.
Oh, but you want to do the work, Joe?
Why.
Now let's talk about aliens building the pyramids. It's so crazy.
But they don't want to do the work. Like Joe Rogan, you really put so much work into your intellectual discovery here.
I know.
It's unbelievable.
I think it's my irony alarm is going crazy right now.
Unfortunately.
Most subjects are very, very nuanced and very deep.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about ancient religion.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about things that were a oral tradition for a long time before they were even written down. So it's a long trudge to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah. Because in historiography, it's the inference to the best explanation. And historians very rarely disagree on the data and the evidence. It's the conclusions that you draw from that.
Right.
But then there are some things that are just out and out false. And I don't think Billy totally knew what I was talking about, but it's those criteria that we look at when we look at something that does come from an oral tradition and eventually gets written down and becomes a literary text. And then you analyze that on the basis of it being a literary text.
This is sort of the problem between with being self-taught rather than conventionally academically trained.
Definitely.
Where you're trained in very specific disciplines and you're taught to understand the foundation.
Honesty, this podcast is the most prominent platform for disinformation on the internet. Right. And he's like, there's a difference between just a guy off the street and a real trained scholar.
Right, and that goes to our point. All we've been saying the whole time is you don't even have a trained scholar on. You have a student on, and you're passing him off as some kind of expert.
And all he does all the time is have untrained people. He platformed the Ancient Aliens guy. He platforms, again, Billy Carson was on his show. That's how he became prominent. Even someone like Russell Brand. Russell Brand does not know what he's talking about when it comes to anything.
Right.
And so if you want to have him on as a celebrity, but to pretend that he has anything significant or substantial to say about Christianity is just silly, I think.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've gotten out of I've probably watched probably 20 hours of your stuff over the last couple of weeks, and you've spent a lot of time on this. This is not a casual, cursory examination of these texts and of religion. This is a long journey. Because I'm always fascinated by people that have really gone down the road, because you don't meet a whole lot of them. I know a lot of Christians that can quote you some versions of the New Testament, some Psalms, but
You can just tell that he has no idea what he's talking about. Even the way he describes that's not how you talk about the Bible. He doesn't even understand the vernacular of the way an expert would actually talk. And again, it's so ironic that he's making this whole claim and giving this guy the credit. I just keep saying the same thing. I'm sorry, but it's just ridiculous. He's like, it's so important to have like a real expert on. And this guy's not an expert. He's a student.
There was a lot of opportunities where Wes could have got into much more interesting things like, what do you mean by oral tradition, Joe? Because we have Akkadian or Babylonian myths and stuff like that, the old ancient Near Eastern myths. They probably started as oral traditions or passed along. Like, that would be something interesting to talk about. Or theories of, like, the Gospels being based on some sort of oral tradition. Not that helpful to people to get more clarity about, like, actual scholarship of the Bible.
Yeah.
how old are you?
I'm 33.
Which is very young for someone who
Spring
has
chicken.
the depth of knowledge that you have. You've been doing this essentially from that miraculous moment. That ignited this spark, even though you came from a missionary background, and then from then on. So for the past 11 years, 12 years, or 20 years.
How about, let's just say, you were born into a Christian family and you were just a Christian your whole life. You never changed your views on anything. And you just decided to grow up and push it even more and sell it even more. There's nothing really spectacular about any of that. A lot of apologists will have a great conversion story, or they'll say, I became an atheist, or I was an atheist, and then I studied the facts. He doesn't even do that. You can tell there's almost like a tension, because admitting that he grew up in a Christian household, it kind of hurts his credentials. So he has to be like, well, I read the Quran though. Like, we had the Quran in my house, so that means I was exploring other things.
It shows how audience captured apologetics really is, because, like you said, you have to have that compelling story. You have to be
Right.
like someone that worked for Nixon during Watergate and then went to jail, or was convicted of a crime that you didn't commit and like found God in prison, or worked at the Chicago Tribune and tried to disprove Christianity until you talked to Gary Habermas. Without some sort of a great story, it's just not as compelling. Exactly what you said, John. It really does force this, not dishonesty exactly, but you're just trying to embellish. Everything has to be more dramatic than it really is.
Yeah, it has to fit into that bio narrative because it's much more sellable. It's a marketing tool. There are people that have amazing backstories that also are great academics, and there's people that have completely mundane, boring backstories that are great scholars. It doesn't make any difference. If what you're doing is trying to get to the truth, it really doesn't matter what your backstory is at all. It matters how much have you studied, how much have you learned, what kind of degrees do you have. All that stuff is really important. This person doesn't have any of that. He doesn't have a degree. He's still in school. So he's touting himself as, well, I grew up in India and I read the Quran and I have this miraculous story of when I was 11 years old, and you should listen to me more than you should listen to somebody else. That's the skepticism I have toward this guy.
In the covenant tradition, like Reformed tradition, you would expect children to grow up in like a godly home, to be godly and sort of be not birthed into the covenant, but at least like raised in the covenant and come to saving faith, right?
Well, it's actually is closer to the first. It's closer to being birthed into the
Yeah.
covenant. I mean, it's almost like a kind of baptismal regeneration type thing where the Lord will bless these parents with covenant children that will grow up in the faith.
So it's strange that this is developed as a necessary component to this kind of American evangelicalism because it doesn't fit with all types of Christianity. And the Reformed tradition has been involved in the major revivals that have happened in America as well. If you go back to Jonathan Edwards, it is the Reformed tradition. So it's not like they didn't have a sense of people coming to saving faith or repenting or whatever. I'm just very sensitive to anything that is disingenuous, or not disingenuous, but
No, I know what you mean because when we grew up, like think about it, like one of the biggest things that would happen were testimonials, whether it was in church or we were a private Christian school and they would have chapel service and there was a big deal to have a testimonial and you go up and you tell your history. And the more dramatic your history is, the more attention it would naturally receive. And this is true in religion and outside of religion. If you have a dramatic history, people pay attention to it. And I'm not saying that's wrong. If you have a compelling story, that's great. And of course, your history will inform and educate you on lots of things in life that will help you. Now, he's coming on as an academic scholar, and I'm saying no. His backstory and his dramatic backstory, whatever it is or isn't, is kind of irrelevant to the things he's going to say about the Bible. The things he's going to say about the Bible need to be published. And that's the way he will make an impact. Like, right, academics, I'm sure, are not taking this guy seriously right now. There's no one in academic circles talking about him because he hasn't published anything. There's been nothing up for peer review for people to break it apart and critique it. What he's done well is galvanize other Christians and convince people like Joe Rogan to take him seriously. But people that understand how biblical scholarship works, they simply don't take him seriously, and they shouldn't.
yeah. So two things related to what you just said. I don't know what it is about human beings that we're drawn to narrative and like to connect to stories, and then I don't know what's wrong with me that I like don't really care about that sometimes. Because if you think about someone like Bart Ehrman, he tells the story of he was a scholar that grew up as a Christian, went to Moody Bible Institute. Eventually, he lost his faith. But the reality is, Bart Ehrman's scholarship hasn't really changed that much. From going to a Christian believer to a non-believer, didn't really change his scholarly positions because his scholarly positions were based on scholarship. And what I really actually find interesting about Bart Ehrman is this scholarship. I absolutely don't care that much about his reverse testimony. I know, like, maybe that's like, but I think there's something in Christianity that is attracted to these narratives that involve people's personal stories. And I just wonder where that comes from, or if that's something that's unique to Christianity. I mean, I guess it's not unique to Christianity.
No, I think it's a human thing. I mean, I agree with you. What you said actually like struck a chord with me because I feel the same way. I think there must be something wrong with me that I don't care about that. I mean, it's not that I don't find it interesting at times, but I think I'm able to recognize when that's important and when that's not important. And even with Bart Ehrman didn't rise to fame because of that backstory. He rose to fame because of his academic work. Before he was even famous, I mean, he's famous in like the things that we're interested in. He's not like a A-list celebrity, but you know
I get frustrated sometimes because I think it almost hinders what he does because people are like, oh, he's just out to destroy Christianity. And I'm like, forget about that whole part. Just listen to what he's saying.
That's a great point.
Like, forget about that whole like bullshit at the beginning. Like,
I agree. I completely agree with that because it's really frustrating when you're talking to a Christian that knows how to debate, and a lot of these apologists, they know how to debate. And instead of dealing with the argument, they're like, well, what's the bias of this person? Yeah. And that actually comes from their own theology because they believe that if you're not a believer, there's something wrong with your heart. And everything you do will be to try to tear down Christianity. So therefore, don't even look at the scholarly findings that they came up with, you can just reject them right out of hand because they're not a believer to start with. So the only people you can really trust and listen to are other believers. And then I find myself trying to find Christians who agree with me on this point or that point. So like, see, this guy's a Christian. You can listen to him, which is really stupid because you should be able to show any scholar's work. It shouldn't really matter what their faith-based commitment is. But I think it's just a fundamental difference in the way that believers think and the way that academics think.
Well, I'm glad that we're both sociopaths that don't care about people's stories. Again, I agree with you. I think it just depends on the situation. If I'm watching a film, I do want to be engrossed in the story. I do want to care about the characters. But when it comes to scholarship, I don't care about a historian's life. I want the historian to, or I mean, maybe I care a little bit, but like I care much more that they're like doing good scholarship.
Right.
And I think I just have a high sensitivity to manipulation, emotional blackmail. I don't want you to be feeding me some story that's going to make me put down my guard, my critical thinking.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. In my life, through every stage of my life, there's people trying to convince me of some kind of bullshit. They're trying to sell me something, and I've had to really develop the skill of critical thinking to be like, no, what am I going to accept and what am I not going to accept? So yeah, I have like a strong sensitivity when I start hearing stuff like that about like people's we're spending a lot of time in this person's backstory. Again, it can be interesting, but it's not really relevant to like whatever your findings are. And the thing about bias is everybody has bias. And let's put it this way. You could be the most biased Christian in the world. That doesn't mean that the facts you're giving me are wrong just because you're biased. You could be right. And that's the whole point. You should try to say, okay, we agree that we all have biases. So let's just look at the facts. Let's just look at the evidence and then come to the most logical conclusion.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent in looking at the arguments. For example, I've been thinking about slavery in history and movements towards abolition. And a lot of the writings that we have that are pro-abolition originate in Christianity. The earliest, I think it's Saint Gregory of Nyssa is the earliest person that's promoting the abolition of slavery. But you also have to think that the only texts that we have are coming from a certain class of educated people. It wasn't like the slaves themselves were necessarily the ones that were freely writing texts or writing the philosophy that was passed around the upper class. So from that perspective, you can say, yes, we're only getting part of the story. We're getting a very specific person's take. Or if you're reading the Gospel of Matthew, you want to understand the author's perspective when you're reading the text. But when it comes to arguments, you should try to look at the argument. In all fairness to Wes Huff, I'm sure he's sort of just following the questions that Joe Rogan's asking him too. So maybe if he had his choice, he wouldn't have even gone through this whole backstory about his life. But he does seem to have it very well rehearsed.
Again, when this started, while he was talking, I just did a quick Google search, and he is very big on his backstory on his own website and anything I see about him. So no, I think it's a big part of, from what I see in my small amount of research I've done on him, it seems like he's trying to set himself up to be the new Josh McDowell, to answer difficult questions for them and make themselves feel better about it. And having this type of strong backstory is super important.
I went to university with full intention of going into the police force. I kind of mapped out this plan that I was going to become a police detective.
Why not? Because you like getting to the bottom of things?
It could be.
Well, someone who spends 21 years like getting to the bottom of a religion, you'd probably be pretty good at cracking cases.
I wonder if every Bible scholar is also a true crime mystery person.
I don't know.
Something to think about.
Also, there was an aspect of when I was in high school where they were like, you got to figure out what you're doing. or you're going to be homeless and you're going to die.
Yeah, I remember that part.
I felt that,
it was a terrifying moment in life.
Man, I always tell people when they're in high school, like, you can chill out. Like, it's going to be okay.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? I wonder if it's different now, because
I think you should have a certain amount of desperation. Because I think that it ignites the fire within you to do something.
there's probably something to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you feel like Joe Rogan is so big and so popular that guests feel like they have to agree with every single thing he says? The guy literally said something, and Joe Rogan was like, I think the exact opposite. And he's like, yeah, you know what? You're probably right.
I think that's probably true.
Because I want to make sure you invite me back on like the biggest show on planet Earth.
Yeah. It's like the part in Malcolm X where they say no one man should have all that power. It's sort of true. Everything is dissolved to such a place where there's just no actual media left. And so you have these unaccountable podcasters, and Joe Rogan is the pinnacle of that, untethered to the reality that's going on in the world and doesn't really have any accountability. And like you said, he's a kingmaker. Whatever he says, people are pressured to continue to have access to his show.
The only thing I know is I saw Bill Burr, I don't want to say stand up to him, but about COVID, and Bill Burr was like, who am I going to listen to, you or the doctors? And I thought that was great.
Well, Bill Burr is like the only person that can think on his feet left in America, I think.
But he's big enough where I don't think he's that worried about, oh no, if I don't go on Joe Rogan, I'm going to lose my career.
Yeah. I mean, he did the same thing to Bill Maher.
Yeah.
He stood up to Bill Maher, and then he's had some choice words to say about Elon Musk lately. So I think it's very unhealthy the way that people have to be his sycophants in order to have access to the platform that he hosts.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you should have perspective and you should enjoy your life as a young person, but you should also realize you got work to do.
Well, and stress is good.
That whole exchange was crazy.
It just totally reversed. It started out, I think kids are too stressed. I felt all this stress, and I
want to tell them, relax.
I tell kids now, like, just relax. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine. And Joe Rogan's like, nah, stress is good. It makes them work. And he's like, yeah, stress is like the most important thing. We need to be stressed.
My doctor just told me I need to get more stress in my life or else I'm going to die young.
Whatever the answer is, it's just funny that literally anytime Joe Rogan says something, the guy's like, yeah, basically, or at least that's partially true.
Maybe it seems like I'm going really soft on Wes Huff, but there would be a lot of pressure just to agree to every fucking thing that Joe Rogan says.
Am I going too hard on Wes Huff?
No, it's fair to be critical.
This is the first time I've heard it.
You should be honest about what you think.
I'm a big believer, I know you are too, in athletic discipline. It needs to go hand in hand with any other type of endeavor because, you know, realize where your inadequacies are. Then realizing, like around my third year of university, my passions and motivations were very, very different. But I knew that I needed to lean into that to some degree, particularly with the Bible. So I have a friend, Andy Bannister. He's out in the UK, and he says if you take Christ out of Christian, all you're left with is Ian. And Ian's a great guy, but he's not going to save you from your sins.
The first time I heard this, I was like, oh, you know, like, that's pretty corny. And I still think it's pretty corny. But the other thing that's sad is that I think that Wes actually has these jokes inserted into his, when he does his presentations and stuff, or like preaches at a church, he has these random moments where he uses puns.
Right.
So that's just another strike against him.
Also, like, you take Christ out of Christianity and you're left with Ian, and it's kind of funny because Ian is just this casual name compared to Christ. However, Jesus' name is Joshua. You literally, when you're praying to Jesus, you could be praying to Josh, and it's the same name.
And Christ means anointed one, or Messiah, and Jesus wasn't even anointed except by the woman of ill repute.
It's even a question if Jesus was actually called Christ in his lifetime.
It's a very complicated question, even beyond just the Ian question. And also, Christian is sort of anachronistic because we only get it in the latest books of the New Testament. It seems like it's not the way that the earliest followers of Jesus identified. May have been even a derogatory term for them.
If the things those skeptics of various worldviews were saying about the Bible were true, then it did actually legitimately undermine what I believed. And so I needed to take that seriously.
What is the oldest version of the Bible or the stories in the Bible? Is it the Dead Sea Scrolls or are there older versions?
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest of the Old Testament. So when they were discovered, so they were discovered in 1946 to 1957. And at that point, during their discovery, they pushed back a lot of our previous oldest manuscripts 1,000 years, which was a big deal.
How old are they?
They're anywhere between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century BC. So it's kind of tricky because the Dead Sea Scrolls they're like a library that we refer to. So it's approximately 970 documents, but it's distributed out between 10,000 and 11,000 fragments. So there's a lot going on there, right? So, and some of these, are so fragmentary that you look at them and it's like confetti. Because they're, 3,000 years old, but not quite that. They're like 2,000 plus years old. Right?
Animal skins too, right?
Well, all sorts of things. Animal skins, papyri, and then some of them are actually done on copper. The first time I was introduced to Marco Allegro was he published a book on what's called the Copper Scroll, because part of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments is this inscribed document on copper, which is an ancient treasure map.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's in Hebrew, and it is wild. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it's like stuff like this. It's papyri, it's animal skins, and it's a number of different languages. So the vast majority of it is in Hebrew, but there's also a lot in Aramaic, and then Greek, and in Nabatean. So it's like an umbrella term to just describe a whole bunch of literature. So a lot of it is biblical because it was written by this group out in the desert called the Essenes, who lived at Qumran. So, but then other stuff of it is just, it's just Jewish literature of various stripes that were hidden in caves all around the Dead Sea.
So the scrolls, as it were, aren't all biblical. Some of them is just accounting of the times.
Yeah.
Wow.
And when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, like you have ones like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is fully complete.
Okay, so before he gets into the Isaiah Scroll, for the most part, factually, he's correct on the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as the dates of discovery and Qumran. I think there's questions whether the Qumran community is necessarily the Essenes, although that was definitely the assumption for a while. I think some people will say Qumran community now because there's confusion about whether they're actually the Essenes or not. But the other thing that I wanted to stress is the eclectic nature of the texts that are found at Qumran, because the way that Wes is describing it is a little bit misleading, as if there's this canon, and then in addition to the canon, there's these other books. And the reality is, I don't think that they were distinguishing between these texts. Like, they may have affirmed different texts than what we affirm as canon. And the things that they had there were like the Book of Enoch or other apocalyptic literature, things that they believed that would not fit with the way that Christians think about conventional Jewish beliefs or what led into what was in the Christian canon.
Yeah, I know he's about to talk about Isaiah, so I won't preempt it, but that's where I was going to go. But I don't really know what his argument is yet, so I don't really want to get into it.
And I'm not really sure what Joe means when he says what's the oldest Bible that we have. I think like John and I try to make this clear all the time. But it's important to think, again, when you're talking about what's oldest, are you talking about which text was written first? Or are you talking about which is the oldest copy that we have? And I'm not positive. I think there may be copies of the Septuagint that are close to as old as some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they would be in Greek. The next time that we have a Hebrew version of the Hebrew Bible is in the Middle Ages with the Masoretic text.
Yeah, again, I don't know where he's going, so I don't want to preempt it, but let me just say this. This is something he already had talked about, the dating. I just want to point out, because I'm sure Joe Rogan isn't thinking this. He talks about the date of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is the oldest copies we have of the Old Testament. It's incredibly late. You're talking about the 3rd century BC at the earliest, and it's describing events that happened 6,000 or more years before that. And you hear people talk about Genesis, and we think we have these ancient documents that go back to that time, to the time that Moses was alive. No, what we have is written so far after Moses lived, if Moses ever lived. That's something that a lot of people don't necessarily realize, that the Old Testament may not be that much older than the New Testament. And that's kind of a fascinating thought, and it's interesting, and it's not something people really... It's kind of like when we talk about the Gospels and the epistles, because I grew up, the Gospels come first, and then you have the letters of Paul later. But then you realize, wait a second, the epistles that Paul wrote, those are written before the Gospels were written. And that's kind of the same thing going on here. We think of the Old Testament because it's describing these things that happened thousands of years earlier, but really wasn't written even that much before the New Testament was written.
The texts chronologically are not the way that they were written either. Like Deuteronomy is written after the Deuteronomist history is done. Probably a book of Deuteronomy that is a smaller, primitive version of what we have that Josiah finds when he does reforms in the temple in the 8th century BCE. Right. And when you're talking about Moses, you're talking about the 13th century, if Moses really existed. So if these purported events actually happened, what time were they supposed to happen on the timeline? And then when were these texts actually written and in what order? But the Dead Sea Scrolls are hundreds of years older than the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And 1,000 years older than our next copies of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, which is the Masoretic text. That was a recreation that happened in the Middle Ages. People were speaking Greek, so you had the Septuagint was floating around in like the 2nd century BCE and 1st century BCE. It's just contextually, it's good to think about this as old, but if we didn't have this, we wouldn't have anything older than the Middle Ages in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Which is pretty crazy to think about. And even with this, we're still talking about hundreds of years after the texts were written, almost 1,000 years probably after some of the events that they're describing.
And then I'm sure we'll talk about coming up, but the differences in the text. So when you do look at the earliest writings that we have, that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's interesting to see how it actually is different than what we have in our modern Bibles.
A different canon or a different library of texts and then different variations within the text.
It's a copy of the book of Isaiah, and it's a full, complete scroll. But then other ones are so fragmentary that we think they're written in Hebrew, but we can't actually tell.
Oh, wow.
Because no one's willing to, like, piece these. And this is true for a lot of stuff. So, the largest grouping of papyri literature in the world is the Oxyrhynchus collection, which we get a good portion of our oldest manuscripts of the New Testament from. But if you go to Oxford and you look at the Oxyrhynchus collection, and you pull out that drawer, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you're like,
right,
like most of it is untranslated, untranscribed, because the amount of man hours that it would just take to even put it together, never mind then go to the effort of transcribing and translating it. Most people are not willing to do that.
That part made me so mad. I'm like, why aren't people in there putting those things together? John?
Yeah.
Right? Why aren't people in the drawers at Oxford right now putting those pieces together and translating them? I want to know what they say.
You're asking me why they're not doing it?
He's like, oh, no one has the patience. Well, let's pay someone to have the patience. Damn it, I want to know what the texts at Oxyrhynchus say.
Yeah, but it's not that simple. Obviously, everyone wants to know that. There's just a massive amount of it, and I think a lot of it is people have worked on it and haven't been able to do it.
Yeah, or they start and they're like, oh, it's another Gospel of Thomas. Seriously, Just thinking that there's these fragments out there that are not being compiled gives me anxiety. I just want to know what's there, or like what treasure could be.
Yeah, I've always wanted a better answer on that. Also, like, who's working on it? You know, is there any estimate on when it will be accomplished or if it will be accomplished? For years now, you just hear that there's all this other stuff that they haven't figured out yet.
Even the stuff they talk about is stuff they discovered in like 1860.
Right, that's very true too.
Like, so it's crazy. They're like, oh, we found this Gospel of Thomas in 1860. We finally translated it. Like,
it's just the way
last
scholarship
year.
works, though. I mean, oftentimes there'll be like new discovery, and then you read into the article, and it's like this was actually discovered 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But it was only published now.
There's the process of peer review. It's fascinating, actually. It's why we can have good scholarship, because there's that process of back and forth and criticism. And
yeah, it's the opposite of the Joe Rogan experience.
Right. It's
Like you don't just like come up with some crazy idea and go onto the biggest audience in the world and just kind of vomit it out. Instead, it's like very carefully scrutinized, and it's not published for years until they're like absolutely certain they get it right. It's kind of unfortunate that the general public doesn't recognize that process as being important, and I think that's my biggest frustration with the world right now.
The more you read about the stuff that they have found at Oxyrhynchus, it's really fascinating. A partial version of the Gospel of Thomas, another gospel that uses part of the Gospel of Thomas,
Right.
Sayings from Matthew and Luke and Thomas. John and I talk about this a lot too, but the other things that were probably out there that we don't have access to now, imagine what could be.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.